Grace to you and peace from God, our Creator, and Christ, our Redeemer. Please be seated. I had been living in Connecticut for just about a year when I went out one night to meet some friends for a dinner at a pub-like restaurant, one of those places that has a sizable and busy bar on one side, which is where we stood next to one of the patrons of the bar while we waited for a table to open up. Perhaps not quite 2 sheets to the wind, but well through her first sheet, she took notice of us and began chatting us up. In hindsight, she may have been trying to flirt, but I have never been very good at picking up on that sort of thing. In any case, it ended abruptly when it eventually came out that I was a priest. Her face changed. Her attention locked in on me, and she began confessing immediately why it was that she hadn't been to church in so long. Another time, I was on a late-night flight back home, seated next to a chatty fellow passenger. We made it through the first half of the flight with little more than occasional exchange of small talk. But as he kept engaging in new lines of conversation, I felt the inevitable question coming about what it was that I did. And upon finding out, we spent the final hour and a half of the flight exploring his beliefs and Christian faith, which was sweet, and I really desperately wanted to sleep. And then there was the time I was in seminary trying to sell a piece of unneeded furniture on Craigslist. While helping her load it into her van, judging me to be a student, she asked what it was that I was studying. I explained that I was in seminary and in the ordination process to become ordained. Her brows furrowed, and she launched into a very concerned conversation about whether I was going to have to be celibate. I can assure you that it was as awkward as it sounds. I tell you this because I am someone who speaks about faith, and indeed speaks about my own faith, publicly and professionally. And there are still times that I'm hesitant to have that conversation, times when I would rather deflect and steer it towards less weighty topics. I was thinking about this fact during our Bible study this past Wednesday as we tackled this very question. Why is it that so many of us struggle to speak about our faith, to talk about our deepest beliefs with even our closest friends and loved ones, much less complete strangers? Because that is, at least in part, what our gospel reading is about. Who do people say that I am? Who do you say that I am? I can imagine the awkward silence in the conversation as the disciples waited to see if someone else would answer so that they wouldn't have to. I can imagine myself standing with them in that awkward silence because I have done it in my own life. Perhaps you can imagine yourself standing with the disciples in this story too. Who do you say that I am? Sure, at one level, we don't want to have those awkward conversations with complete strangers, whether it's on the plane or on the road or at a restaurant bar. But there is more to it than that. Aren't we afraid to speak of our faith for fear of being judged by others? Whether we are afraid that our faith will be made the butt of a joke or because of the more recent rediscovery of the church's involvement in residential schools, is our fear of speaking born out of a sense of shame? Or perhaps we're afraid that if we talk about our own beliefs, then others will perceive us as trying to push our views upon them. And we've seen what that looks like from certain Christian traditions, of the way it alienates and hurts others, and we are loath to be seen as zealots. Those are the 2 reasons I most often hear others express. They're the reasons I most often have felt myself. But when I stop and think about it, I think they really only scratch the surface. If we really dig in and examine our reluctance to open up about our own faith, I think that we find that it's rooted in a fear of vulnerability, of sharing with others something that is deep and profound, a fear of exposing to the world an aspect of our true selves. And if we dig even deeper than that, if we really examine ourselves and our reluctance, I think that we are afraid of giving voice to our belief, and in giving voice, giving it the power to change us. I think that a part of us understands that when we answer Jesus' question, something about us is transformed. One of the last trips I made before the pandemic began was to Edinburgh. And while I was there, I had a spare day with nothing planned. So I decided to do something different. I decided to put myself way outside of my introverted comfort zone. I decided to go and strike up conversations with complete strangers. And not casual conversations, but big, deep conversations that get to the meat of things. Questions about joys and about things that break our hearts and about our deep hopes. In other words, questions about life and about faith. And it was an amazing and life-changing experience. I met a woman who owned a cake shop and a cafe, and as I drank coffee and she decorated this beautiful cake, she shared with me her experience of being a Muslim woman in Scotland, about the joys of the local mosque community and the difficulty of city services in her shop's neighborhood. And I met a man who was gathering signatures for a petition. He didn't live in the city, but he loved the city and had an infectious laugh as he shared his stories of joy. And I met a young man who had built a new life for himself, having escaped abject poverty in his home country. Expressions of loss and grief and hurt and anger all flashed across his face as he spoke of leaving behind his family and everyone he had ever known. But they were replaced with pride as he shared about the new life he had found in Edinburgh, where he was now the manager in the cafe and gaming shop where we sat and talked. And his face was filled with serenity as he spoke of the classes he was taking at the university and of attending musical performances at concert halls. You know what? In these conversations, I found that I was being changed. For one thing, I found that they were no longer strangers, but people I cared about deeply because we had shared something deep. I found that I began seeing the city through new eyes. As I walked around visiting the places they had mentioned in their conversations, I started seeing glimpses of the world as they saw it, as a tapestry of joy and grief, of hope and brokenness. But most of all, I found myself growing in my own sense of faith and my own discipleship. I began to understand that this was the sort of thing that Jesus wants me to do, wants us to do, to become vulnerable and so enter into the vulnerable places of the world, so that we may bear witness to everything that makes up our lives and the world around us, all the wonderful and the terrible things, to be witnesses in the midst of it all to truth and faith. Who do you say that I am? Our reticence to speak about matters of faith with others, strangers or otherwise, well, it does protect us from uncomfortable questions and awkward silences and unwelcome questions. But it does more than that. It protects us from the beauty of being vulnerable together. It protects us from hearing the profound stories and truths that others have to share with us and that we have to share with them. And most of all, it protects us from being changed by the experience and transformed by the answer that we give. Jesus has asked the question, what will you answer?